Okay, guys, to finish up some stuff with Chapter 28, we're going to take a look at the aggregate expenditure model and show you what that looks like. Just to kind of get things started, we're going to look at changes in equilibrium GDP and how that ultimately will be impacted by the multiplier. So in a closed private economy, any change in the investment or consumption schedule will impact equilibrium GDP. If investment or consumption goes up, then equilibrium GDP will also need to go up to account for that. If investment or consumption goes down, then equilibrium GDP will subsequently have to go down as well. So looking at the aggregate expenditure model that Keynes created for us, we can get a general idea of what's going on in the economy by looking at the various columns. So you can see our first column is looking at possible levels of employment. This is millions of people in the economy. The second column, we have our real domestic output and income, which is our GDP or our disposable income. This is in billions of dollars. Right here we have our consumption. Right here in this column we have our savings. We have investment here. And then we have our aggregate expenditures. Now notice that our aggregate expenditures is basically just combining our consumption, this column right here, with our investment, which is this column right here. And this, of course, is also in billions of dollars. Now, our last couple of columns are looking at our unplanned changes in inventory based on what's happening with our aggregate expenditures in comparison to our GDP, and then also the tendency of employment, output, and income. And so as we kind of go through this, and if we take a look at this, what we're going to first off look for is where is the equilibrium GDP in this economy. And if you kind of go through and take a look at the real domestic output GDP, and you look at these numbers over here and you compare them to the aggregate expenditures, you can see that the economy is in disequilibrium at a number of different places. Like, for example, in the first one, the first row, where our output, our GDP is at 370 billion, but our aggregate expenditures are at 395 billion. We want an additional $25 billion worth of goods. And so obviously GDP is going to have to increase in that case, which means that unemployment would probably go down most likely. But the other problem with that is you're going to be dealing with inflation most likely. Okay, you just kind of keep working your way back and forth until you get to a place where there are no unplanned changes in inventories. And so when you look at that, you can see that at $470 billion in GDP, we also have $470 billion of aggregate expenditures in the economy. So basically everything that's being produced is being consumed, and the economy is essentially at equilibrium. All right, now kind of using that same model, we wanted to find the current equilibrium. We already did that at $470 billion. But the next couple of things we want to do is we want to work with the MPS, or the marginal propensity to save, and basically use that to create this thing called the multiplier, which basically accounts for the repetitive circulation of currency in the economy. And so we're going to show you how to do that here in just a second, and then just kind of work through these other scenarios here. So we're going to using the MPS, we're going to find the multiplier for this economy, and then the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to assume that there's a dramatic drop in interest rates that causes an increase of $5 billion in private investment, and ultimately how would that affect the equilibrium GDP in the economy. So we're going to go back over to the model and take a look and take these on one by one. So the first thing we have to do is we have to calculate out the marginal propensity to save in this economy. And if you remember from the worksheet that I had you guys do, the way that we determine what the MPS is by looking at the change in savings. So we can see here's our column right here of savings, okay? And we have to divide that by our change in disposable income, which is right over here. And so if you do the math on that, you can see that the change in savings as we work from one row to the next is 5 billion, all right, or just we can put it in 5, that's fine. And our change in disposable income is 20 billion, or 20. And so if I go 5 divided by 20, which is how I ultimately end up determining what the marginal propensity to save is, what I'm going to come up with is 0.25. And if you remember from the worksheet with the MPS, remember that disposable income either being saved or spent is kind of an either-or proposition. So if the marginal propensity to save in this economy is 0.25, then the marginal propensity to consume is going to be at 0.75. Okay, so now that we have our marginal propensity to save being at 0.25 in this economy, and again, it's the 5 billion divided by the 20 billion, so we get the 0.25 there. The next thing we want to do is we want to calculate out what we call the multiplier. And so again, the multiplier accounts for repetitive circulations of money in the economy. If I buy something for $20 from Bob, Bob's going to save $5 and he's going to spend $15. The next person that gets it is going to take that $15 and they're going to basically save 25% of it, and they're going to spend 75% of it, and so on and so on and so on. And so that's what the multiplier helps us to take into account. find the multiplier, all we have to do is have the marginal propensity to save. And then what we do is we do 1 divided by the MPS. And if we go 1 over MPS, so in this case it's 1 over 0.25 in our scenario, in this economy particularly that we're looking at right here, 1 divided by 0.25 equals 4. And so what that's telling us is that any injection of investment or increase in consumption or anything like that, that's going to have an effect in the economy, but not just by the initial injection, but also by the multiplier. So our example that we're looking at is if we saw interest rates drop in the economy, which increased gross private investment by 5 billion. So this column over here, which is at 20 billion, it goes up to 25 billion. How will that ultimately impact the economy? Well, if we look at it and we think about it, if we take that additional 5 billion and we multiply it by our multiplier, if you remember that that's 4, and again we got that by going 1 over the MPS, so 1 divided by 0.25 equals 4. So what that's telling us is that if we had an injection of an additional $5 billion into the economy and we multiply that by 4, what that'll do is that'll create about $40 billion worth of new investment in the economy. Now the last question it asks is how does that ultimately end up affecting equilibrium GDP? Well, if we go back to this chart here, we can see that our original equilibrium GDP is at 470, right? So aggregate expenditures are at 470. Okay, real domestic output GDP is at 470, so we're at equilibrium. But now all of a sudden we're injecting an additional $40 billion of investment, which means that our aggregate expenditures is going to go from 470 billion all the way up to $510 billion. Now, if our aggregate expenditures increases from 470 to 510, that additional $40 billion, well, our GDP is also going to have to increase by $40 billion. And so what we'll find is that our new equilibrium GDP for the economy also needs to be at $510 billion. And if it doesn't get there, what we're going to end up having happen is our aggregate expenditures are going to exceed our GDP, and in that, we're going to end up having inflation. Okay, that's it for that portion of the lesson.